Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Clean Sweep Fall 2025 virtual webinar series. Um, the Clean Sweep, this program is coming to you from the Clean Sweep program, and that's an educational and outreach program with the goal to provide cities and MS4s with the information and tools they need to reduce nutrients and sediment loading to downstream water resources by implementing a street sweeping program that targets water quality. The program is coordinated by Maggie Karshnia, who will be presenting today as well. Um, and it's also a collaborative effort between the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council, Sea Grant Minnesota, and the Pollution Control Agency. I'm Paula Kalineski. I'm the coordinator of the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, and I will be presenting two of our four 30-minute sessions today, or they're 25 minutes essentially, with the first one being Why Sweep for Water Quality. I'm showing our schedule today. We're on a tight schedule. Let's get started. Why Sweep for Water Quality? I think the short answer on this is that street sweeping removes solids and associated pollutants that are that collect on the streets before they get into our storm sewers and into our downstream waters. So, done, right? Just stop there. I mean, you can see on the picture this time of year, we have a lot of leaves on the street, and we have street sweepers coming around to keep those off the street, partly for safety, but also to keep them out of our storm sewers and downstream waters because they add nutrients to those downstream waters. Um, but this it hasn't really historically been easy to demonstrate the water quality benefits of street sweeping. And so today we're going to take a little deeper dive into some of the science that really brings that point home. So first, just very briefly, if you are thinking about adding additional sweeping for water quality, we'd like to remind you that there are other benefits of street sweeping that can help you make the case for some additional street sweeping. And that includes things like reduced maintenance for your BMPs, by reducing inputs to the storm sewers. You can also reduce loading to BMPs. Think things like pond forebays, sumps, rain garden, turrets, all those things that receive the water that's coming from our streets. There are human health benefits, by removing particulates from the street, we can improve air quality. And obviously, those water quality benefits can also not only have the impact of cleaning up our waters for recreation, but also, some of us have surface water, drinking water sources. So we're protecting drinking water and improving safety, both by reducing the risk of skids, and then reducing localized flooding. Oftentimes, storm drains, when material collects around those intakes, you can end up with clogged drains, and by increasing the amount of street sweeping, you can reduce the amount of localized flooding in those problem areas. So, once again, why sweep for water quality? Let's go into a little more detail. These are some of the things we'll be looking at today, some of the details. We'll be talking a lot about trees since they are an important source of phosphorus and nitrogen inputs into our storm sewers. We'll take a look at how cost effective this BMP can be. We will talk a bit about MPA. You can get credit for street sweeping, so this is another reason to do some additional street sweeping. Credit being waste load allocation credits for MS4s that have phosphorus TMDLs that they need to address through their MS4 permit. And then we just covered some of the co-benefits of street sweeping. So in looking at the science, we'll be looking at a body of work that comes out of Minnesota, starting with the Prior Lake street sweeping study that took place between 2011 and 2013. This study was the brainchild of Ross Bintner, who was the water resources engineer in Prior Lake at the time, and two researchers at the University of Minnesota, Sarah Hobby and Larry Baker, who were co-PIs on this study. I'm also very familiar with this study because it was the subject of my graduate thesis when I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota. So what does this study look at? It looks at how the density of over street and near street tree canopy cover influences the amount of material and the character of the material that you can recover from street surfaces through street sweeping. So essentially looking at the solids that collect on the road and how much of that can be pulled back through street sweeping. The study was set up to look at both that canopy cover density variable and street sweeping frequency. So we had 9 street sweeping routes that were swept over the course of 2 years. We collected a total of actually more than 380 sweeping events, but some of them we had, lab results and such that didn't come through. So there's at least 380 solid laboratory results for those for sweeping events. The 9 routes were put into 3 tree canopy categories. So we had 3 routes that had a low canopy cover. That would be a low canopy cover density in the over and near street area. And I'm showing that on this graphic on the slide. 3 more that had a kind of medium canopy. This low canopy would sort of correspond to like a new development or maybe a land use where a lot of trees weren't planted. Most of these routes were in residential areas, but we had a little bit of industrial and um, commercial, mostly industrial type areas as well. Medium canopy cover would be areas where trees have been growing for a while. They're a little bit older development. And then the high canopy cover, you can see there's quite a bit of dense canopy cover on this high canopy picture that's very near streets or close to those streets. And then within each of these categories, we had a route that was swept just once per month, one that was swept twice per month, and one that was swept 4 times per month, or essentially weekly. So what did we look at? What we measured is, first of all, how much total solids was collected every time the sweeper went out. So there was a vehicle scale that was used to weigh the street sweeper before and after. And then when they dumped that material, we would take a representative sample and send that off to the lab. And it looked kind of like this thing in the middle. It would come in frozen. And then we would analyze that for moisture content to get a dry weight and essentially look at the phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon content of those organic matter content as well of these fractions. So we were able to sieve the sample into kind of particles smaller than 2 millimeters, which are sort of soil-like particles. They might include some organics, but it's kind of silt, sand, clays, and bits of organic matter, and then these larger organics like leaves and grass clippings, etc. So what did we find? So we measured the content, the nutrient content of these sweepings. We knew how much we were collecting each time we went out. And well, as we kind of anticipated, it was sort of uh, intuitive a study, I think, where we had more trees. We definitely had more coarse organic matter on the street and consequently more phosphorus. So what this graph is showing, we have light blue dots showing those 3 low canopy cover routes, red dots showing the medium canopy cover routes, and the darker blue showing the high canopy routes. And you can see this is phosphorus that was recovered through street sweeping on the y-axis. And then we've got this overstreet tree canopy cover. So you can see that as the tree canopy cover gets more dense, we get more phosphorus. And also you can kind of see that just by looking at the low, medium, high comparison. Obviously, the low canopy doesn't go all the way out, but very clear result and this is kind of for the whole on an annual basis, very clear result that more trees equals more phosphorus on the street. Here's another way of looking at that. We found that there were a lot of seasonal patterns. Some things that really stood out to me when I was analyzing this data is that not only when you're looking at trees, you expect the material on the street to have more phosphorus and nitrogen in the fall because you have all this organic material, right? But I was surprised how much phosphorus there was in the spring, and that's partly due to residual material that's left on the streets, leaves that didn't get collected, that fell a little late, that got tracked back into the street, etc. And a couple of other things. So again, this graph is just lumping our routes into higher canopy and lower canopy rather than low, medium, high. But you can see that the higher canopy, which is the light green, tends to have more phosphorus, than the low canopy. That makes sense. But also, it really doesn't, the streets, first of all, they're not clean after one sweep in the spring. It takes a while for the loading rate. So this y-axis is showing you the pounds of material. In fact, the pounds of just the phosphorus component of that material. The pounds of phosphorus recovered for each mile swept. That would be like a lane mile, a curb mile or a lane mile. Um, but notice that it doesn't really drop off after one sweep. It takes a while for that to settle down. So, you think about the spring and we recover all that material that's on the street from winter. And then we have spring inputs like leaves and helicopters and all those things that fall on the street. So there's loading to the street in the spring, and that material tends to be very rich in phosphorus. So then we get into the middle of the summer, and those phosphorus loads kind of level off for a while when plants are more mature, and maybe there's just grass clippings. And then, of course, we see a big spike in the fall. So again, it takes more than one sweep to manage that springtime material. And so, a big point of this graph is if you are thinking about doing additional sweeping, not only do you want to hit this fall maybe a little harder, but the spring is a good time to do some extra sweeping. Oops. I'll just cover this one super quick. This graph is showing the blue line is the amount of solids, or I'm sorry, the percent of solids. So we're looking at the contribution of coarse organics. So if we take that material that was collected from the street and just look at how much of it was the coarse organic part, the bigger than 2 millimeters, leaves, grass clippings, etc., by a percent. When you look at the solids, if you're just thinking what percent of those solids is coarse organic matter, it's usually less than 50%, right? So if you're just looking at the truck, it might not seem like those coarse organics are very important. But if you are considering the amount of phosphorus or the amount of nitrogen that's contained in those solids, then most of it for the nitrogen is in the coarse organics. And I know nitrogen isn't as much of a concern as phosphorus, but you can see that phosphorus is oftentimes, in that 50% or more range at different times of the year. And this is all the routes averaged together. So you can imagine that line would move up if we were just looking at those higher canopy areas. And then finally, another thing we tracked in this study besides the nutrients was the cost. So we had program costs that were provided by the city of Prior Lake. And what this graph is showing, I took the most cost-effective route, which meant, and I'm quantifying that as pounds, dollars per pound of phosphorus removed. So we knew how much it cost to go out and sweep each time. We knew how many pounds of phosphorus we recovered for each sweep, and we could, take some averages by month, by route, etc. So on this graph, I've taken two of the sweeping routes, and for each month, I've kind of averaged those costs to get an average cost efficiency for each month. And you can see for this high canopy route, and these are let's say $2012, there were many sweepings that for which it was less than $100 per pound to collect that phosphorus. So, you'd have to do some adjusting to compare for today's costs because sweepers are definitely more expensive than they were in 2011. But that is incredibly cost effective compared to other BMPs that might cost, hundreds, thousands of dollars per pound of phosphorus collected or removed. Our least cost effective route was a very low canopy. You can kind of intuit this, right? Where there's not a lot of trees, you're going to get less phosphorus. So we took a very low canopy route. And even for that route, the most expensive, the least cost effective route was at about $600 per pound. And that would be, that's July, right? You're sweeping in an area with almost no uh, trees, maybe even sweeping weekly, so you wouldn't really expect. I will say one other point that comes out of this. Oh, here, I should have hit the next slide, but we're highlighting again that you can collect phosphorus for very very cost effective in a very, very cost effective manner with sweeping when you, especially when you target that sweeping to areas with a lot of coarse organic inputs. Um, One last point I'll make on this is that when I was analyzing this data, I was very surprised. That truck never ever came back empty. Um, Even if you were sweeping every week in a low canopy area, and the streets looked clean, that truck never came back empty. So there's always something that would be collected. This study was later expanded a couple of years later to develop a phosphorus crediting calculator for the Twin Cities area. The university, I didn't participate in this study except I was on the advisory team, but the study was expanded to four more cities. So, and an additional 200 or so samples were collected of street sweepings. So we have a broader sampling base to look at. And we wanted to validate the results of the Prior Lake street sweeping study to see if we could develop a reliable credit for this. And I will say some of the things that came out of this second round of sampling and testing was that we did validate those Prior Lake study findings. This is an example from Forest Lake. They participated in that second round of sampling before they started submitting samples. This is at a time when I worked as a consultant. I had done some work to estimate the benefits of street sweeping for them, for the city, by estimating how much phosphorus they could remove through some additional sweeping. And what we predicted was that if they enhanced their sweeping from their baseline of twice, they were doing a twice per year spring fall sweeping, and if they enhanced it, and it depended on the route, that sweepings were essentially once per month, maybe twice per month in some areas, maybe only 4 times per year in others. But that sweeping plan we developed, we predicted that they would collect 120 pounds per year of phosphorus based on the testing. We had results for 47 of their 55, and that's, many routes all over the city. So those laboratory results for 47 of the 55 enhanced street sweeping events showed that they had already recovered 142 pounds of phosphorus, which was more than we had predicted for the 55. So the tools that we have, I think they tend to be reasonably conservative, and hopefully, when we're talking about the tools, what you'll find is that you're likely to pull up even more phosphorus than what the tools predict. This is super quick. Another study. This was Ben Janke's work. Just not only do you recover more phosphorus from the street, but this compares those watersheds and shows this is concentration of phosphorus in stormwater. And I think this is on an annual basis, but this is tree canopy density over the street. So we get more canopy over the street and the concentration of phosphorus goes up. So it's not just solids on the streets. There's evidence that it's increasing the phosphorus content as well. Some follow-up studies in the city of Oakdale and Woodbury have looked at the cost of street sweeping. These also seem to validate those findings of the Prior Lake study, where we're finding that street sweeping, the cost benefit of it as dollars per pound of phosphorus removed remains in that sort of below. I think in Woodbury, I don't have a number here, but I think it was around 450 in that $400 to $500 range, with some routes having an even better cost efficiency down, in $200-300 range per pound. And Oakdale had some very cost-effective sweepings. This is 2023 data, so again, it might need to be adjusted a bit. I think I'm coming up on our time here pretty soon. I will make a couple last points here. Street sweeping can be an extremely cost-effective BMP. It definitely takes more than one sweep to get streets clean in the spring, and that's a very good time to add some additional sweepings, in addition to additional sweepings in the fall. I will say, so that was the end of my presentation. I think, do we have a minute or two for questions?
Yep, we got about 4 minutes for questions.
Okay, so I am going to stop the slideshow, and I'll take any questions if there are some. I don't know if there's any in the
So,
chat.
Paul, looks like we've got a question from Henry Stetlin. Can you speak a bit as to why the rate is evaluated per curb mile rather than total swept surface area?
Yeah, I guess because there are some other things, yeah, per curb mile. I think because it's kind of an operational parameter. So when we've evaluated the costs, part of those costs are associated with the distance that you drive the vehicle, right? Both maintenance costs, fuel costs. There's a speed that drivers can, they really shouldn't exceed. So the time is related to that as well. And it could be translated to surface area. But I guess there's so many variables involved, and there's a lot of, when we talk about the estimating tools, we're really ballparking things and making comparisons, and it's the comparisons that have value. Um, and the ballpark estimates are kind of that. They're ballpark, right? So I don't know. I hope that makes sense. It's the curb mile, the distance is kind of built into other variables that we took into account.
Thanks, Paula. Another question is, are you aware of any municipalities which have looked into or implemented ordinances requiring leaves and litter be swept up by the property owners, much like winter snow and ice removal is handled?
I don't know of any that require that. Certainly, a number of, many municipalities have leaf collection programs, and I think a lot of them have ordinances that you can't sweep your leaves into the street. Um, but I can't give you an example uh, of our ordinance that requires them to remove them, if they, to remove them from the street, I guess. Yeah. We can do that voluntarily through adopted drain programs, though.
Great, thanks,
Is that
Paula.
good?
That's all of our questions. Our
Okay,
Green for
yeah.
Member
Oh,
Kat, I
go
think, is
ahead.
going to drop a few more things in the chat.
Okay, I probably shouldn't have stopped sharing my screen, but I'll just pop it back up there again. Uh, Again, so we have another session coming up at 10:30. You will need to use the meet if you're going to join us for developing an enhanced street sweeping plan, and I hope you do. That will be Maggie will be presenting that. You'll need to use the invite that was shared for that particular session. Each session today has a unique Zoom invite link. If you weren't able to get your question into the chat, you can certainly email questions to myself and Maggie, and I've got our email addresses up here. So thank you for joining.